Started. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. This is the Comparative Historical Analysis and Theory Network's first flash talk of 2022. And we are going to start with a real barn burner where we are going to have the co-editors and several of the authors from the recent Political Power and Social Theory special issue on the global historical sociology of race and racism discuss the special issue with us and answer any questions that we may have from the wonderful crowd that we've assembled. And my name, by the way, is Nick Wilson, and I am the one of the two secretaries of the chat network. And before I hand it off, let me just say, if you aren't familiar with us or what we do, please visit comparativehistorical.org and check it out. Join our mailing list. We are a network of people who are broadly interested in comparative historical analysis and theory, as the name might suggest, and we look forward to the discussion. So without further ado, let me introduce now Alexandre White, who is going to chair the panel and is also one of the co-editors of the special issue. Alexandre is an assistant professor of sociology and the history of the science of medicine at Johns Hopkins University and received his PhD from Boston University. So without further ado, take it away, Sasha.
Hey, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Happy New Year, everyone. It's so nice to see so many faces that I recognize in 2022. And thank you, Nick and Louisa and everyone from chat for helping to organize this session. It's a real pleasure. What we've got planned for you today is really kind of, in the beginning, Katrina and I will introduce the volume, talk a little bit about why we wanted to put this volume together and how we did that, the kind of intellectual, historical, epistemological questions that we were seeking to answer or at least pose by this volume. And then we'll open it up to three of our absolutely brilliant authors from the volume, Mishal Khan, Heidi Nicholls, and Luisa Schwartzman, to discuss some of their papers. So yeah, it's a real pleasure. I want to also thank especially Julian Go, who's the editor of Political Power and Social Theory, for giving us the platform and opportunity to do this and put this together. It was a labor of love, and it's a piece that's been building for a while. Katrina and I started working on putting together this volume. We decided it was what, 2018 when we started, so we're really excited that it came out this year. The kind of intellectual thrust of this volume was really to attend to some of the issues and problematics that we saw within comparative historical sociology, especially when it related to the ideologies and theories of race and racism. And we saw this kind of both within, or we saw certain absences and silences both within the field of comparative historical sociology, but also the field of the sociology of race and racism. And we thought that actually, a comparative historical approach to the study, and then one that's also global, to the study of race and racism would generate new epistemological and ontological interventions into thinking about how to study racism as a world historical force. We know that attempting to sketch out any sort of generalizable elements of race and racism really remains an ongoing challenge. Scholars have argued that race as a technology of social organization is so commonplace that many turn an uncritical eye towards it, assuming that we all operate with or under the same definition of it. Thus, we can see racism at work and race making at work at a variety of different moments, but historical sociology seems to, in many ways, lack the epistemic grounding and vocabulary to really consider it. As a result, we too often tend to lose sight of the central role that racism plays as a world historical force at the center of not only European modernity, but also beyond Europe and the West entire. Racism, while understood as a Western intervention, is not unique to the West, and moreover, European ideologies of racism travel and have been influenced greatly by other ideologies and technologies of difference making. So Katrina and I thought that we should develop a volume devoted to the concerted and sophisticated global historical analysis of race and racism, one that is attentive both to the temporal and spatial specificities of racial orders and ideologies, but also reflects the ways in which racism has shaped the whole world. As such, this volume is intended to be a call for new research and also present wonderful examples of this sort of sociological, historical, and epistemic projects. We also wanted this, this volume to be, expressly a vehicle for junior scholars to present their new cutting edge work. And I think we managed to achieve that quite well in the breadth of authors and scholarship that we have in the volume. So I want to open up to Katrina to provide another half of kind of the introduction to this volume.
Thanks, Sasha, and thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, I to not reiterate too much of what Sasha said, but sort of underscore some of the points that he made. I think when Sasha and I talked about what we'd like to see the sociology of race and racism do, we thought a lot about how careful historical analysis really matters for thinking in more complete ways, not just complex ways, but complete ways about the sociology of race and racism. And at the same time, we saw space for comparative historical sociology to do more work on race and racism and think about how hierarchical boundary drawing matters for understanding the so-called modern world, which is a question that a lot of us in this space are curious about. And as I think we all know, it can be hard to get work like this published. And I know a number of us in this chat space have talked about the lack of outlets for historical articles. So we also hope that we could provide a venue for longer form pieces, especially to junior scholars. And as if, the volume is rather long, as is the intro that Sasha and I wrote, but if you've skimmed any of it, you can probably tell that we take a lot of inspiration from scholars outside of US sociology, who I think that both of us tend to think as better understanding, describing, and theorizing race. For example, people like Stuart Hall. And so in addition to what Sasha mentioned, I think that I especially, and I know Sasha as well, but I don't want to speak for him, that we're interested in work that goes beyond US-centric and Black-white understandings of race. And it's not as if that these aren't important or real racial formations, but that we think of them as some among many. So this volume, and we're interested in how racial ideas travel, adapt, intersect, how the local and global meet. And I think that to better understand how race matters in the world, we need to leave the empirical question open. So just as we shouldn't export US concepts of race to other places, we also shouldn't assume that European or US ideas of race don't make their way to other places. So we can study that process. And a number of the papers in the volume do this. So overall in the volume, we wanted to embrace the complexity and diversity of the world. In our education and the work that we do on our own, we saw room for more studies of different places and times. And we believe that our scholarship and ability to understand the world is poorer for the lack of substantive diversity on this issue. As you can probably tell, we have a pretty capacious understanding of race and racism. So in this volume, we're interested in processes of division, exclusion, forcible inclusion, that are based on ideas not only of biological, but also cultural difference. And so for us, it's, again, as I mentioned, an open empirical question, as if, let's say, the ways that white supremacy operated against Black enslaved people in the United States in the 1800s is similar to anti-Blackness in colonial India. And you'll hear some about that today. And this reflects our position on theory as well. The goal isn't to generate a universal model, as Sasha mentioned, or to posit universal processes, but we think that theory should generate new empirical questions. And for example, we know that the processes of democratization and nation building, et cetera, in Europe are not universal. And it's only through a denial of empire and racism that we could believe this to be true. So what do existing theories, what kinds of questions do they bring up when we bring them to new places? And we hope that the new contributions in this volume will also raise new questions for people who've studied things like democratization and nation building in Europe. we think that it's important to understand the different ways that people have divided the world and the different tools of racism. And we think this is important not just for our scholarship, but hopefully with the hopes of addressing racism and inequality in the world today. We can't solve problems when we don't understand the problem to begin with. So those are some of additional reasons that we thought this volume was important and that we're really excited about the contributions. I'll just briefly say that the papers in this volume, I think we identified, and this is in our introduction as well, 4 things that we think they do to push the sociology of race and racism forward. And that's to think about how race is made on the ground. So the papers are open to other forms of status differentiation and ways of understanding human groupings or human kinds. They identify processes of closure that support racial distinctions. The papers also analyze how meaning and categories change. So they really take seriously the idea that race is not fixed. They also consider race transnationally and think about how race travels, but is also adapted, thus taking place seriously, seeing how ideas of racial difference are adapted in particular places and particular times. And we think this is something that could be explored a lot more, these mechanisms of interchange between the local and the global. And the last thing that we see the papers doing is thinking about the relationship of past formations of race to the present. So here we could think a little bit more about the conditions under which some formations of race, perhaps from colonial eras, are stickier than others, and what makes them last. So those are some of the things that we think these great papers in the volume do. And so I hope you can check them out. And we have 3 presentations from authors, so you'll get to learn a little bit more about, get to sink your teeth in a little bit more to data that illustrates what we're talking about here. Thanks.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I think you can tell from both Katrina and my talking about this volume just how excited we are about it, how wonderful it was to produce it, and how great it was to work with the authors who really made this volume entirely what it is. And without further ado, we'd love to introduce some of the authors to present their particular chapters in this volume. So first, I'd love to introduce Heidi Nicholls from University of Virginia.
Thank you, Sasha. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this, this chat talk. I'm really excited to be a part of it. Thanks to Nick and Louisa for organizing. And just heartfelt thanks to Sasha and Katrina and also Julian Go for making this volume a reality. So I'm just going to share with you kind of, a few years after this process started, what is still really kind of theoretically exciting to me about this piece of my own work, if I can say that. And the main arguments I make, and briefly then what those are, how those are related to the significance of this global historical approach that we as sociologists can really push forward in time to come. My chapter ultimately argues that the sovereignty of settler colonial states, such as the United States as one example, is racialized in the sense that sovereign claims and the enactment of such claims through the material processes of conquest hinge on racial ideologies, including global and historical narratives of whiteness. And I attempt to demonstrate the ways that race and racism are not just tools to divide, exclude, or marginalize existing populations from or within the nation state, but rather race also conscripts populations into settler colonial projects to claim them as a part of a lineage of empires. The ideologies around how people came to be in certain geographic locations, living with and on certain lands, is also immensely important to maintain certain fictions of empire. And these fictions, of course, include race itself, but also the widespread denial of empire. In the case of US occupation of Hawaii, these fictions include that the US is a multicultural or multiracial nation state, of which Hawaii is often presented as an idyllic example. As I summarize in the chapter, racialization attempts to convert national and indigenous identities into racial categories, which denote membership as a citizen in this multicultural, multi-ethnic nation state. So racialization disrupts indigenous difference when indigenous peoples are represented as racial groups which must have an a vested interest in the US state. US empire state sovereignty can therefore be considered racialized sovereignty, not only because groups are differentiated and excluded on the basis of race, but because they're also often homogenized and forcibly included through race. And here I am building on the work of Miley Arvin and her theories of whiteness. So race becomes a dominant semiotic landscape through which settler colonists understand indigeneity and through which the state legalizes notions of indigeneity into US law. This is part of the overall project whereby settler colonists seek to replace natives as such. So therefore, in the article, in the chapter, I'm talking about how these myths of settlers and settler states inheriting colonially constructed notions of indigeneity are being drawn from actual aspects of indigenous nations, forms of governance, and culture. And relating this to kind of the introduction of the entire volume, in addition to biological notions of race or cultural notions of race, I'm trying to point to how ideologies of race emerge and proliferate to cover over political positionalities that result from settler colonial occupation and expansion. And that this is very significant in settler colonial context. It's very crucial to processes of erasure. I argue that racial ideologies remap the demarcations between groups and the relationships between groups and the state. And this has a territorial component as well, kind of a territorial analog, if you will, whereby the US settler state remaps occupied lands as part of the US, creating geographies of proximity and inheritance that conflict with indigenous geographies. In this way, settler colonialism impacts the land materially as the empire state claims lands, but disregards their ecological health, disregards ecological relations. As Hawaii was remapped to appear as integral to the United States, as always oriented towards North America and destined for Americanization, Hawaiians and other racialized populations in Hawaii were remapped into racial understandings that denoted multiracial citizenship. And it makes sense that settler colonial actors and institutions in Hawaii did this, considering that Hawaii was an incorporated territory prior to 1959. Government officials leveraged Hawaii's non-whiteness in the sense of its demographics and its population, and its potential inclusion through statehood as proof of the United States' dominance as a purportedly anti-colonial world leader devoid of racism. So in my chapter, in building on theories of resignification, I aim to contribute analysis of what race signifies in settler colonial context, as well as that such signification is done in this broader realm of indigenous resistance, resurgence, Hawaiian sovereignty. And I demonstrate this through the use of a resurgence archive of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, or PVS. And this is a Hawaiian organization that began in the 1970s, often credited with really kickstarting the cultural and political movements that are sometimes referred to as the Hawaiian Renaissance. And in the paper, I present the three main ways that colonial resignification is undone or unraveled through this resurgence. The PVS was founded to resolve a debate about Hawaiians had migrated to and lived in the archipelago hundreds, if not thousands of years before. And I want to say a bit more about this debate because I think it relates to global ideologies of race, historical ideologies of race more broadly. The Polynesian problem, as it was known, was the debate that circulated from the 1880s and continues to exist in some forms today. In the 19th and 20th centuries, European and American scholars created theories that cast Hawaiians as, quote, primitive versions of white civilizations, or as descendants of the Aryan race. Their arguments are like an example of how racial mapping furthered settler colonialism. The Polynesian problem literature began to propose that because Hawaiians were, quote, a lost Aryan race, end quote, who had accidentally drifted to the archipelago, whiteness was in some way indigenous to Polynesia. As scholar Miley Arvin summarizes, quote, This logic naturalizes white settler presence in Polynesia and allows white settlers to claim in various ways rightful and natural ownership of various parts of Polynesia. And so European and white American scholars and settlers sought to possess Polynesia and Polynesians through whiteness, end quote. So while the Polynesian problem literature cast Hawaiians as primitive drifters and quote, degenerated, long lost white people, end quote, the PBS efforts to revitalize two-way voyaging resignified Hawaiians as indigenous peoples and nations in relationship to native nations in Oceania that were similarly impacted by colonization, in some cases also settler colonialism. And in the process, Hawaii as a place territorially was also resignified in relationship to indigenous geographies. Finally, I argued that the PBS, in tandem with Hawaiian sovereignty movements, was able to, in a sense, resignify the United States and US occupation as imperial, as harmful to Hawaiian social and ecological relations. I gesture at the end of the chapter to the ways that the three targets of colonial resignification are interconnected. And I think even might be seen as intimately contingent, although that's an empirical question that I'm still trying to work through. And so the three are, right, that land is being resignified as belonging to an empire, in this case, US empire, that people are resignified as belonging to the empire as citizens or as racial minorities. And the empire is resignified as, again, the multiracial, multi-ethnic, democratic nation state. And then I don't discuss this much in the chapter, but I want to touch on that this relates to whiteness and to global ideologies of race more broadly, because then settler colonists are resignified as indigenous through whiteness. Within this kind of greater mythology of Aryanism, civilizational progress, modernity, and human development. But again, going back to kind of the main points of the chapter, the PBS was able to combat the parasitic internment of Hawaiians of Kanaka Maoli history and culture, and to disrupt US claims to sovereignty, which invoked such colonial resignifications. They did so by enacting Kanaka practices and relations, geographies, two-way voyaging, within a temporality that ran counter to such global ideologies of race. And I think I will end it there, and I really look forward to hearing from the other contributors. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heidi. That was wonderful. Next up, we have Dr. Mishal Khan from the University of Texas.
Thank you, everybody. I just want to quickly clarify, I'm no longer at the University of Texas.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm in between, right? I'll be starting a postdoc at UC Hastings in the new year. So it's always a bit of an awkward transition when people move through institutions. So thank you so much to everybody for this. I really, this volume in particular, I've been part of the journey for at least some of the way. So I've sort of seen how it's unfolded, and it's really exciting that it finally came out last year. And to see the crowd today, I think sort of confirms a suspicion that this was very timely and really needed in sociology. It was fortuitous for me because I have been working on this particular paper for years and years and years, and was really beginning to lose hope, worried that I would not find a home for this kind of work in sociology. So I really have to thank Sasha and Katrina and Julian Go and the rest of the GHS community for really making sure that scholars such as myself and people working on similar things feel that they have something to say and something to contribute to the discipline. So I will kind of use my time to think a little bit, to talk a little bit about not the chapter itself. I hope that you all go and read the work, the brilliant articles. I'll sort of recap just the main argument, but really focus on the implications and what I sort of hope the bigger takeaways from my particular pieces and how it sort of connects to these other conversations that we're having in comparative historical sociology, in global historical sociology. Sort of open it up from there, and hopefully that'll generate some questions. So my article is really about many different things. It was really hard to sort of pin it down into a bite-sized chunk that I could put in article form. But it really centers on two interconnected stories. The first one is how slavery as an institution became racialized to become associated with Africanness, Blackness, represented through the Shidis. The Shidis are a sort of the colloquial term for a group of African origin people in South Asia. And I'm going to unpack the term Blackness and Africanness, and I do at great length in the paper. But basically how the term slavery became associated with this particular community in South Asia. The second story is how Indian slavery ended up disappearing and how these two processes are actually really closely connected. But more broadly, sort of, thinking about broader sort of consequences for comparative historical sociology, it's really about the violence and the epistemic injustices unleashed when we compare categories across time and space without interrogating the knowledge structures that go into reifying them in the first place. So, I'll try and unpack that a little bit later, but going to the main sort of puzzle that I spend most of my time unpacking in the paper and dwelling on and sort of contemplating at great length. The central puzzle is this. Before abolition in 1841, colonial reports estimated that there were over 8 million slaves in British India. After 1843, there is almost no mention of slavery at all, except over time, the label of slavery increasingly becomes concentrated on Shidis. And still, that's a very small sample of the occurrence of the term slavery at all in this context. So in order to try and unpack this puzzle a little bit, I deploy a kind of mixed methods approach. Wearing my deep historical hat, I try to give as much detail and nuance about the particular encounters as possible through anecdotes, through specific moments in the archive when you can hear your historical actors try to speak back, and through the layers of very convoluted colonial sources. So I try to do as much of that as possible, but I also thought that just maybe I could capture that magical change over time effect that allows us to see racialization in motion. So therefore, I focus on a collection of 122 cases or encounters that I gathered from the archive and try to examine the shifts in language used to describe people who were illicitly transported in or out of British India during this time. So I kind of broaden the scope. I try to include every instance in which the term slavery, of course, but also kidnapping, abducted, trafficked, or servitude, or some kind of suspicious movement of a person. I pull all those cases together. And I find over time that there is an increasing, not just increasing, but overwhelmingly increasing association between Shidis and the term slavery. Meanwhile, what happens is that when Indians are involved, a range of cases, a range of labels are used from free to servitude, dependent, kidnapping, or trafficking, but almost never the term slavery. And so I quote from the paper, as the law committed itself to turn a blind eye to Indian slavery, the institution seemed to all but vanish, disappearing in a puff of smoke. The tiny Shidi community was, in a sense, the residue left behind. So that's sort of what the paper is about, and that's what I trace. And I just want to sort of end by thinking about the big arguments. So firstly, what I'm trying to do in this paper is really center abolition and liberal ideologies as a crucial part of this story of slavery and abolition, of global slavery and abolition. So when we look at the colonial world, perhaps we should be paying attention to abolition rather than slavery as a racial project. And then also paying attention to the fact that it can take multiple forms. So indeed, in my particular case, these were benign processes of freeing rather than violent processes of enslavement. Yet the consequences were pernicious. Secondly, this has consequences for our understanding of constructions of belonging and national identities. So the argument, the erasure of Indian enslavement and the hypervisibility of Shidis both had political, social, both had dangerous political and social consequences. And they continue to shape the way the Shidi community in particular is absorbed and considered sort of a primordial part of the Pakistani nation state today and the Indian nation state. So, you know, there's reverberations in terms of how these communities are increasingly otherized by this label of slavery. And then, of course, my argument really is trying to speak to this broader racial capitalism literature as well. So I think of global abolition as sort of the left hand of racial capitalism, conflating vast and varied milieus of people encountered into races, and at the same time producing differences between colonized others in ways that justified alternative modes of economic and social domination. So a crucial part of this story is how India became a safe space for global capital in the global South in this era of abolition. We know that this legacy continues today. Also, this is about how Blackness and race itself was constructed as a modern way of apprehending human difference, and that slavery was resignified to serve as the antithesis of freedom to justify the emergence of Western capitalism. And finally, to sort of make the maybe broader political, and I think it is a political point, that anti-Black racism and Black enslavement is not historically inevitable or geographically ubiquitous. So I really want to pay attention to reconfiguration rather than grafting or exaggeration of pre-modern social hierarchies. And part of this is that we might be able to say, and I want this to be a little bit provocative and not to be taken literally, but to be sort of an invitation to think about this more. But can we say that slavery as a specific constellation of forms, social death, natal alienation, property, and race, is itself a social and legal fiction that emerges through abolition? And what are the consequences of this reconfiguration? So I will end there, but I just want to say that I hope that this volume signals a new era in work that not only brings many times and places into conversation, but demonstrates that some of the most pressing issues that we face today in the modern United States, racism, white supremacy, racial capitalism, does not just have consequences for the world, but was in fact born on a global stage. So I really hope that this is the beginning, not the end, and you know, go forth, all young scholars out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was brilliant. Yeah, sorry, I was taking copious notes, so I was a little slow to the mute button or the unmute button. Well, last but not least, we have Dr. Luisa Schwartzman from the University of Toronto to present on her work, and then we're going to open up to broad discussion. So please get your questions and thoughts ready. And you know, at the conclusion of the final presentation, please put your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to triage those. So without further ado, Dr. Schwartzman.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so my paper, I don't know if I'll be able to summarize it well here. So it's in my website. I thank everyone for inviting me for the special issue of Julian Go and Alex, Sasha and Katrina, and for the people to organize this panel as well. And I'm not such a junior scholar, but I'm new to comparative historical sociology, and also my paper is about Angola and Mexico, and most of my work is about Brazil, and so this is also new for me. The title of my paper is Seeing African and Indigenous States and Society, Decolonizing and Degrouping Race Scholarship's Narrative of Conquest and Enslavement in the Early Modern Atlantic World. And here I'm also decentering the Atlantic to focus on the South Atlantic and not the North Atlantic. And so here, this picture is a picture of when the Portuguese came to the Kingdom of Congo in the late 1400s, I guess, and kind of thinking about the kind of how their relationship, the relationships of power between Europeans and Africans, right? They were much more equal, right? They were not, you can't kind of take European power for granted, right? And they had to kind of actually enmesh themselves in these societies and negotiate this power, right? In order to acquire it or whatever they wanted. So I'm doing the opposite of the previous speaker who was looking at the moment of abolition. I'm looking at the moment of the beginning of enslavement and colonization in this paper, right? So let me see if I can pass this slide. Oh yeah, okay. And I'm gonna read a little bit of the beginning of my paper. In 1621, Jinga Mbandi, sister of Ngola Mbandi, king of Ndongo, arrived with a large entourage of soldiers, servants, and slaves in the Portuguese colonial settlement of Luanda to negotiate a peace agreement. Upon arrival at the meeting place with the governor, she noticed that there was a golden chair for the governor to sit and only cushions for her on the floor. Jinga Mbandi called one of her servants, who crouched down, and Jinga sat on the servant like a chair. This way, she sat at the same height as the governor, establishing herself as an equal. While the Portuguese governor wanted to establish that all Africans were inferior to the Portuguese, Jinga Mbandi, a powerful princess, this is a drawing of her, soon to be queen for 30 years, rejected this narrative. She demanded an equal status between her people and the Portuguese by rejecting the colonizers' attempt to homogenize all Africans. Instead, she highlighted status differences among Africans. Just as the Portuguese differentiated between nobility, commoners, servants, and slaves, so did Jinga Mbandi request that the Portuguese recognize this differentiation among her people. In the long view of history, the Portuguese governor's classification project prevailed. But in the days that Jinga Mbandi spent in Luanda after this meeting, the Portuguese colonial officials temporarily accepted Jinga's definition of the situation. Through war and diplomacy, she fought for the next 30 years to maintain her power and control over which Africans from her region could or could not be enslaved, and to limit the ravaging effects of the transatlantic slave trade on her subjects. While European colonizers might have wanted to homogenize Africans as well as indigenous people in the Americas, they had to contend with the reality that their power was far from established. They had, at least initially, to learn how Africans and indigenous people organized their institutions and made social distinctions among themselves. To resist the Portuguese colonial encroachments, Jinga Mbandi would also strategically harness social divisions between Europeans, particularly between the Portuguese and the Dutch, and make local allegiances, in particular with the powerful Kingdom of Congo to the north. Okay. And I think this is how, this was a picture painted at the time, which not all pictures are. So maybe that's how she looked like. The way that I narrated this is different from the way that a lot of race scholarship that's very influential in sociology has been narrating this early encounters between Europeans and Africans and indigenous people. Which is actually seen as kind of the founding moment of the white supremacy and race in the Americas, right? By doing that, so what do these scholarships often do, right? And maybe I took this out of context, but reading the books, you also get a similar idea, right? Charles Mills in The Racial Contract, right? And I admire a lot of these works. I don't want to be like critical, but because that's wasn't their focus, right? But I think we should try to incorporate some of these insights from historians into our narratives about the present as well, right? So he kind of says, in the early phase of establishing white supremacy, overt physical violence was, of course, the dominant phase of the political project, the genocide of Native Americans, the conquest of 2 continents, to Australia, the Middle Passage. So the one thing that he does is that he's compressing, right, several, like a 300-year period, right, in different places into one single narrative where white supremacy is there from the beginning and white people have power from the beginning, right? And although this process was violent, right, there's other things that are going on that we need to talk about, right? So it kind of erases the agency and the power and the sophistication and the institutions of African and indigenous people, right? Fagan talks about, from the beginnings, European colonialism relied heavily not only on the growing entrepreneurial bourgeoisie, but also on these nation states, most especially their well-equipped military organizations. So in the beginning, the European nation states already had well-equipped military organizations, and they already had nation states, right? So that's actually not, it's dehistoricizing Europe, right? And how nation states and their military power and political power and economic power was actually built through the process of colonialism and enslavement, right? And so they didn't have that in the beginning. Actually, in my paper, I talk about, the Habsburgs and how, how Portugal and the Netherlands and Spain were actually sometimes together, sometimes separate because of the dynastic, right, changes. So they were familial states, right? Military power was decentralized, right? They actually relied on bringing military power through allegiances with indigenous people and African peoples, right? So all of this got built over time. Didn't exist in the beginning, right? To the same extent. Wynand talks about, I brought this to highlight the question of categorization, right? But confusion and division also characterize the subjugated, right? And he's talking about Africans and African Americans in the New World, right? And so, but the idea is that, well, maybe not all Africans saw themselves as one group, right? They saw themselves as different peoples, and with different social statuses, right? And we can't naturalize that, right? And so, how can we tell the story differently, right? And so, tell me if I'm running out of time because I didn't count the time.
You've got about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So, so one is to think about the process of colonization and enslavement happening in the context of pre-existing African, indigenous, and European social political structures, right? And the idea is that in the 1500s, or whenever we're looking at it, right, they were different than they are now, right? And also making African and indigenous, so for African and indigenous political and social structures to kind of actually take the time to investigate what they were like at the time, who are the people, what are the political entities that existed. I call them states, right? To say, well, they did have political organization, right? And that's really important, right? It's part of the anti-racist project to kind of take that into account, right, as well. And for European social and political structures, we shouldn't kind of use a presentist understanding of it, right? Because that's also a racist assumption, right? But also because analytically, it's not correct. You don't have an analysis of the event. So there's two reasons, right, to not do that. Okay. So I guess that's what I said already, right? And looking at the agencies of particular actors. So it's not to say that they had freedom to do whatever they wanted, right? But to see what are they doing, what decisions are they making, what are the constraints, right? To which extent it's a constrained kind of agency. Sometimes they have no agency, right? But so it's not about agency versus structure, but it's kind of just looking at what people are doing to historicize what they're doing, to seeing about how they're building relationships, right? How they understand the world, right? I guess. So none of this is new for historians, but a lot of this hasn't been incorporated in our understanding, in our general accounts, like in sociology, like about our legacy of slavery and racism and colonialism, for understanding the current racial hierarchies, right? So You know, we should look at the making of the modern world as multi-centered, not only within Europe, right? And Julian Go had said that already. And we should pay attention to like the specific practices of classification, right? And political affiliation and differentiation. So here you have a process, right? Where I try to understand how racial categories become consequential through the process of colonization and enslavement. But you can't then, you know, think that racial categories were the most important thing that organized the way people acted at the time, right? And so these are two sources that I use for my paper. One is Linda Haywood's work. I mean, there's other sources that I use from other authors and from her as well. And I'm not so in dialogue with the argument of the book, but I look at kind of the more like the events that they, I mean, obviously there's theory in that, but I look at the, you know, the political structures in Africa. And so the process of enslavement has to do with the breakdown of these political structures, right? With how Europeans kind of ally with different political factions within. They had to understand African politics, and the same happens in Mexico, right? And so that's how they kind of generate war in the African case, and they are able to enslave people. And there's a breakdown of the political system in West Central Africa, which is today Angola, right? I guess they call it that way, the historians. And similarly, the same happens in we're about the time in Mexico, right? You have, you know, these, so European, so these three places, Europe, Mesoamerica, and West Central Africa, they had kind of they tried to understand their political system where kind of military and economic power were kind of part of, there was no nation state, right? They were the hands of lower nobility, then, you know, traders, right? And so it's how you mobilize these powers and you make these allegiances, right? And so the European power comes from bridging the Atlantic, right? And then bringing, you know, armies across the Atlantic and resources and stuff like that. Anyway, I don't have time to talk about all of this, right? But the main point of the paper is to try to understand the process of colonization and enslavement and the creation of racial categories through understanding in detail the social and political structures and relations as they evolved of these places, of the America, like in this case, Angola, Mexico, and of the European colonizers. So I'm not gonna, this is just a graph that I didn't put in the paper, but I thought it was interesting. And you can see that after the breakdown of the Kingdom of Congo, which Linda Haywood talks about, and the death of Jingambadi, right? That's when the slave trade takes off in that region, right? And so the political aspect is very important. Anyway, and then that's the time when race becomes important. So it doesn't matter if you're a king or a queen or a nobility, right? You're gonna become enslaved, right? In that region of Africa. So the racial category becomes more important than other statuses that existed for your fate, right? So anyway, I'm gonna stop here and we can talk more about in the Q&A. Sorry.
No, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. So I want to open it up to, or we want to open it up to discussion. I want to thank our authors once again, and also mention the other authors who are also in this volume, including Eliza Luft, who's here today, but also Susan Thompson, Michael Warren Murphy, Marcella Bort, Ricardo Hammer, Tina Clark, and Kazuko Suzuki, who also provided critical and really important papers to this volume. So my thanks to them. As we get our comments in the chat, and also like a queue of potential questioners, you know, I just want to say less of as an editor and more just a fanboy of these articles, that, you know, I think that these presentations and the articles even more so really highlight the ways in which the authors in this volume are rethinking, rehistoricizing, and producing and developing new sociological theory into the role of racism as a global and historical phenomenon. We've seen in each of these pieces the ways in which the authors have considered very closely the particular local and global ways in which race is made, race and racism is constructed and applied, noting the fact that racism is not necessarily ubiquitous, but is central nonetheless to the structuring of modern systems, liberal states, liberal ideologies, and the ways in which fundamentally, to paraphrase Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall, race operates as a prism through which to see the modern world, but also as a technology central to its formation. So without further ado, as we see some comments coming in, the first one from Anne Orloff. I wonder if you want to ask your question directly.
If you wouldn't mind, I just had oral surgery today, so I'm not
sure. I'm happy to.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So Dr. Orloff's question is: I wonder if the panelists could talk a bit about specific comparative and transnational global strategies for understanding these phenomena. Who would want to take that? Louisa, go ahead.
It's a very general question. I don't know what you're trying to get in. I think I like the global transnational part. Like I think that well, first there's a question of regions that we haven't looked at that maybe we should look at, right? But also kind of I think it's in the special issue too, like to look at not comparative but transnational, right? Or actually it's not transnational because that assumes nations, right? And sometimes it's pre-national, right? But it's kind of interconnected, right? But so I don't know exactly what, we have to be more specific about the question, but I, for instance, there's a lot of comparative work on, Brazil, United States, and South Africa, right? But like, what's the relationship between those places, right? There's some work on that, but like, if you look at Angola, for instance, like, Angola is close to South Africa, right? Angolans are coming to Brazil, they're coming to the US, right? What's the relation? How about like racial communism, right? Cuba and Angola became communists. I don't know. And like, what was that during the Cold War? What's the, I don't know. So there's other connections that you could build. I'm just using the Atlantic example. You can talk about Asia too, right? But these connections, I think it's interesting it's a new thing to, I mean, I guess historians have been doing that, but we should also be doing that.
I can go next. Best of luck recovering from the surgery. I'm interested in comparative cases of settler colonialism and whiteness globally, and that it being an empirical question kind of in each settler colonial context. To what degree is ideologies of race furthering this process of settler indigenization? And I think there are, I've read about examples in South Africa that are, I think, similar to some processes in the US, but people could do this work comparatively for a number of contexts, like Israel, Palestine, Aotearoa, Australia, other settler colonial contexts. So I'd be really interested to see that, or maybe that would be kind of, a dream to do way further down in my career path. And then, that question of settler colonialism and race, both before kind of pre what I would call like settler colonial projects really instantiating themselves as supposed nation states. And that process historically for these different contexts, how that would vary.
I could just jump in here to say something, just one small point. And this is something I really had to confront with my own research because I ended up having to make my case study a specific geographical area that by all accounts is a backwater, even in South Asian studies. So I look at Sindh in India. But what it really made me see very clearly was how the construction of spaces of marginal are very much an important part of the construction of places that are central, and that extractive processes in these places aren't usually glamorous research sites. So you have to sort of sift through dusty archives, thinking about land sales and, dusty is a good word to describe the place that I study. But the payoff is immense. And in terms of strategies, I think it's paying attention to the spaces that don't get a lot of attention and that seem boring, I think, at the outset. Because there's a lot of stuff that goes into making them appear as such. So that's maybe one strategy.
So I'm just going to jump in here as well, even though I'm not a panelist. And I think Sasha and I had some thoughts about how we think about global work in relation to comparative. And this is an interesting space to do this in chat. And so I'm curious about other folks and their approaches to comparative work. But I think Sasha, I think you do this in your book project as well, but the way that I think about my own work, for example, is it's not comparative. So I study, I won't talk about my work at length, but basically I study the United States empire in the Philippines. And it's not comparative, but it's relational. And it's about how the United States ideas of rule and racial management of these people shaped structures, not only in the Philippines, but in the United States and globally. And so I think there's limits to comparative research that Louisa was sort of alluding to, if we think about the kind of classic comparisons of Brazil, US, and South Africa. And so I think when we do comparative work, we sort of have to ask ourselves, like, what is the container? And are these places that we're comparing to one another actually sealed off from one another? Or are ideas traveling? And so I think Sasha and I favored a global approach to thinking about these things, to think about the circulation of ideas and knowledge systems, and how that constitutes systems of relation between different people and places. So that's my sort of my brief answer. Sasha, do you want to say anything before I list the cue?
Yeah, I can jump in really quickly, which is to say that, I think that the, hopefully what some of what you got in the presentations and thinking about the presentations as a whole, explain some aspect, or at least go some way to answering this question, which is to say that, there's space clearly for comparison, for instance, in Mishal's analysis to, for instance, logics of abolition in the Caribbean and the ways in which liberal ideologies of abolition were put forward and set forth in talking about Jamaica, for instance, in the work of historian Sasha Turner. But that's not to say, and that's to say that, these are distinct cases in some ways, but also these ideologies are traveling back and forth between one another and around the world. So recognizing the sociology of knowledge questions, I think, that are also at work in these sorts of projects is kind of critical to thinking about how racism and racisms operate and have operated around the world. So I think a little bit of methodological and intellectual promiscuity in thinking about how we design our containers and think about that, and how those, and the sealedness of those containers, I think, allows for this sort of work to be done that encounters both the relational and the comparative approach.
I'm going to say something again, because you just made me think of something. So I'm just forcing us all to listen to a conversation among friends, which is that what I find more interesting to study, at least in my own work about race and white supremacy, is how the actors are making comparisons, like what kinds of comparisons they're using, rather than assuming that those things are actually distinct from one another. And then seeing how, for example, like ideas about American Indians shape or don't always rule in the Philippines. And so it's not a comparison between the case of American Indians and Filipinos, but it's an analysis of the kinds of tools of distinction that elites are employing. Okay, so I'm gonna get to the queue. So we have Luna, and then Jonathan Whitson, and then Eliza. I also just want to invite Eliza to respond to any of these questions as well, because she is a contributor to the volume. So please, Eliza, jump in when you want to say something. So Luna.
I jump in then really quickly on this question before we move off topic, because I don't, I don't want to, even though I'm a contributor, I want to hear what everyone else has to say. But I think one fundamental thing that is so important is that if you are a sociologist trained in the US and you're studying race somewhere else in the world, it's inherently comparative, because so much of race theory is premised on the naturalization, or the assumed naturalization of the Black-white binary, the way it works in the US in the present. And the second you travel to other parts in the world and you start asking questions about race, and this will tie into my question later, you see that it works differently. And the second, it's not just going to other places in the world, it's also studying history. So when I teach my students about race and violence and symbolic violence and classification and all these things that I cover in my paper, I always say there's two ways to denaturalize the Black-white binary in the US. One is to compare across time, and one is to compare across space. So you can obviously look at the US historically and how the racial categories have changed in the US over time and continue to change. I talk about MENA and push for the MENA racial category, and I just want to shout out, I include excerpts from Mara Loveman's book, and Mara's in the audience here. I include excerpts from Neda Makbule's book, and Neda's on the audience here. There's a lot of people doing exciting work that are looking even comparative within the US, or with Mara's work with Latin America, to challenge our assumptions over time and over space, and how people are pushing for changes in these categories and how they happen. But then the other thing is just to question even what we are learning in the present as a scholar who cares about how race works somewhere else, anywhere else. And that to me is almost like it's a comparative and global strategy that I think so many of us, I could be wrong, but who are contributions to the special issue, I don't want to say we take it for granted, but it's like a driving force. It's this inherent recognition that what we're reading doesn't explain the phenomena that we're interested in. And so we start asking all these questions and trying to explain them. And to do that, you just have to look elsewhere, whether elsewhere means past times or elsewhere means past places. So now I'll let others go forward.
So I know that, Louisa, you want to add something, and I'm just wondering actually if we could collect the question from Luna and Jonathan, and just because I think that we'll have a tendency to sort of keep building off of one another. So maybe we could take Luna and then Jonathan's question now.
Okay. So this question definitely could be asked of any of the presenters for any of the data used, really, but it came up when Mishal, am I pronouncing that right? Mishal? Okay, good. It came up for your presentation, and so I would prefer to hear your response first. So although now that you started talking about your dusty archives, you may actually not have some of the answers that I was interested in terms of your, what you kind of intuitively found about this question. So I feel like from your presentation, I got a sense of the kind of role of the state and the colonial powers in racialization and racial formation in this way that you're talking about it. And we see that a lot of these state-sanctioned categories in this case stuck in different ways. And I was wondering, this might be like a question of just how you're kind of intuiting this in your own research beyond this. Like, you may not have the answer to this, but if you do, I would love to hear it. But potentially the role of people who at that very time period were perhaps not intentionally or intentionally challenging or resisting these categorizations, and even resisting or challenging these hierarchies in particular, and whether or not that stuck. So the question is really about, like, on the other side of whether or not it's like colonial state categories versus perhaps categories being used outside of the formal, which again might be outside then of the formal archive, but whether or not you think that these have sticking and staying powers, and how these kind of relate to then the larger lasting racial logics? So that's the question. Like I said, it could be anyone, I think, could answer it in interesting and different ways.
Can we take Jonathan's question and then Mishal, you could answer?
Hi, y'all. Thanks so much across the board for all of this. I'll go quick. Louisa, there was something when you were talking in your presentation that sparked this chain of thinking, and it had to do with those early encounters. And you said they didn't walk in the door with their classifications and categories, that they emerged through the interactions. And your paper is dealing with this early moment and this kind of early modern moment of a global, system of interactions. And it made me think of the question, which is kind of to everybody, but it is sort of to Sasha and Katrina, and then to all of us as a community that are trying to hash this out. And it's a temporality of what we're doing at a meso, but maybe in a macro scale. And as you guys are putting the volume together, the temporality of the chapters is really, it covers all of these different moments and sites at which this work is happening. So it just made me think about how we're putting this together into something that does then kind of intervene in, like Aliza, what you're talking about, and into these just accepted presuppositional ways of thinking in the field, that we tell a different narrative, like a different story that really can have traction. And actually, it kind of is what Anne's talking about in some senses, like gives us a big frame that we kind of are sort of agreeing on that scope.
Great, thanks, Mishal. You want to go ahead?
Thank you so much for the question. I think, the question of resistance, maybe I can tie it back a little bit to what Jonathan is asking as well. I guess the point is that, yes, at every single moment you can find resistance, and there is resistance. So in the very beginning of my paper, someone's trying to be freed and he's turning around saying, "I'm not a slave. Why are you trying to free me?" So, I mean, that's definitely a part of what is going on. But what I'm more interested in, and I think that this comes back to what Sasha was saying about the sociology of knowledge question, is how these processes continue to refract resistance and to place upper limits or boundaries on what kind of resistance is possible. So at a later stage of my paper, and I don't go into it as much, but the sort of ethnographic piece of my research was talking to people who are trying to posit an alternative history of Blackness in India, and their voices being drowned out by members of the Shili community. So, that kind of limiting in scope, that kind of clamping down on possibilities is, I think, part of what we're all struggling with, and political actors today are struggling with. Another thing is, I think not just about slavery, but about work, defining what is work. And so many struggles around trying to resist hegemonic definitions of what that is. So yeah, I think that the resistance question is really important. And I think ultimately what we're all trying to do is find alternative spaces, right? Or alternative futures for imagining how race looks, or the evaporation of it. But we know that the evaporation of it is not the evaporation of inequality. So, understanding how these specific processes continue to relodge themselves is, I think, part of what we're all trying to do. So yeah, that's my response. Thank you for the question. Always have to remember resistance.
Can I go? Should I go, or should someone else?
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. I think, well, I'm gonna go answer more the second question that was more directed to me, I think. So I think the temporality question is something that was really in my mind. And I think that there's a tendency for us to compress time. And that really makes a difference if you're talking about colonialism in the 1600 versus in the 19th century, right? In the technologies that were available, the balance of power. and partly it's because the 19th century is an accumulation, right, of power, right, and technology and imbalance, and like it's completely different. Like, so, and a lot of our narratives about race are focused on the 19th century, and right, and so I think, yeah, if you're gonna make a sweeping generalization about that, it took a while, right, and it's also important to think about, yeah, actually it took 300 years for us to like colonize the Americas, right, to go to the West, right, if you think about North America, right, for the nation states to form, right, like in Africa too, like only the 19th century the Europe occupy Africa, right. I mean, obviously it's not that the 300 years before there was this process of increasing European power, of destruction of African societies, through warfare, right, but the balance of power kind of, but it also you want to highlight kind of how resilient a lot of those places are too, right, and how they adapted, right, and how they reorganize their political structure. Sometimes there's a work to be done, right, and I think historians have done it too, but right, yeah, the Palmares, right, for instance, there's like different things that the Métis in Canada, right, that was a new formation, right? So there's all this in between category. It's kind of racist to like erase all of that, I feel like, too. I mean, it's all apart from the analysis, right? With the categories, it's also important to think that, maybe in the archives you are gonna find, if you look at Portuguese archives from like before, like, I don't know, the Middle Ages, you're gonna find like already distinctions, racial distinctions, right? Like the way they see Africans, right? But when the colonizer goes to Angola, right, how, can they just impose that? Or do they have to also figure out who is the king and who is the slave, and which polities are there? How do they make the distinctions, right? They have to, like, on the ground, it might matter more or less depending on the balance of power, right? So that's what I was trying to argue. Anyway.
So I can just add to Jonathan's question. I think that, and this actually dovetails a little bit on Richard's question that was just in the chat. But I think one thing we wanted to unsettle in this volume is any hard and fast definition of racism in a rigorous comparative, or in a rigorous historical and sociological way, which is to say that we can 19th century forms of scientific racism were not uniform. So therefore, there were disputes. There was in the 18th and 19th century different visions of how many different races there were and what the meanings of those races are. Similarly, you're not going to impose 19th century visions of scientific racism on 13th, 14th century Middle East, or on anti-Semitism in Europe during the Black Death, for instance. Sorry, my history of medicine hat just popped on. But in visions of the Black Death and blaming disease on the movement of European Jewish populations, because fundamentally, while racism is in operation in these spaces, the ways in which racism is operating is very different according to different logics. So I think this is what we tried to build in this. And I think this is really what all the papers jump on. And I think Elisa, I'd invite you to come back if you want to, because I think Elisa and Susan's paper really shows the ways in which colonial visions of racism map or kind of undergird more post-colonial visions of racial orders and racial organizing, and the messiness within that, and the violence within that. But I think what we were trying to demonstrate, and I think what we call for is this there's a sophisticated historicization of the forms of racisms that we're working on, and employing what George Frederickson calls kind of understanding racism as a scavenger ideology, which is to say, or what Stuart Hall calls race as a floating signifier, which is to say that racism, especially for those who are racialized, is never any one thing. Any aspect of culture, of civilization, of biology, of your being could be picked up and then used as justification to, or as a technology of exploitation, isolation, alienation. And recognizing that possibility is kind of central to a global historical project of studying and analyzing racism.
Okay, the queue is Eliza. And Richard, I don't know if you want to pose your question, if you want to come on and pose it to the group, but I think that Sasha answered parts of this, and then maybe the panelists could also speak to the specific questions that Richard posed. So let's do Eliza first.
Yeah, thank you. So my question actually relates to Richard's. Well, I'll just say first, if you want to read my article, it's actually all about resistance to shifts in classification processes. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, or shifts in categorization and classification processes, because they're not the same thing, right? The category is the label that you give to the creation of difference. The classification is the meaning you attribute to those categories. And if we take seriously that, if we're going to talk about definitions of race, for me, race is a practice. It's something we do. It's a way of dividing categories of human beings and giving those divisions certain kinds of meanings. And in some places, those meanings are called race. In other places, those meanings are called ethnicity. And as I show in my paper, actually, in some times it's called race, and in other times it's called ethnicity, but it's referring to the same categories all the way along. And then what people do with those categories and how they feel about those categories and identify and interpret the meaning of those categories for themselves can change over time also. One of the things I show is that people maintained the race category. So I shouldn't just say people, let me be specific. I look at Rwanda and I sort of look, the heart of the paper is about how people are resisting the Rwandan state's efforts to reclassify Hutu and Tutsi from racial and ethnic categories to national categories, whereby they're all Rwandan. And they're supposed to say we are all Rwandan. And the idea is that the Hutu and Tutsi racial divisions of the past are partly what led to the genocide. So if we can just get rid of these divisions, if we can dissolve these categories and imbue people with a national identity and a national self-understanding, then violence won't happen. But what you actually see, and this is kind of a problem when you're doing historical work, as anyone will tell you, is sometimes you don't have any evidence that speaks to the perspectives of people in the 19th century who were subject to these racial classification processes. But you can look to certain events to see that people resisted them. So for example, I want to talk about my whole paper because we are limited on time. Very short version is you can see that external colonizers came, they tried to harden these more fluid Hutu and Tutsi categories into clear racial categories that made them fixed, that made it impossible to change them, that attributed presumed physical differences to biological differences, even though those physical differences, like all race, were not so neat. And even though the racial term sort of stuck, the meanings attributed to those racial terms didn't. And that's one of the reasons why you were able to have a Hutu revolution, because Hutu said that we are not these inferior others, we are not less than, we are the original natives of this land, and we are more powerful and stronger and better, and we should overthrow the Tutsi elite. So they accepted that there was a racial division, but they said that the meaning of the racial division was different than the colonizers said. You know, the colonizers said Tutsi were elite. They said, no, we're the true elite. Tried to overthrow them. Anyway, you can read the paper for the rest, but what you see now is that because of the genocide, people are holding firm to their Hutu and Tutsi identities. They're really important to them. They're really important to their personal and familial legacies with violence. And despite the state's efforts to dissolve them in favor of a new national identity, they're still tying them to false histories that don't take their genuine experiences with violence into account. So people are still finding ways to maintain their racial identification, even though to us Americans, they all look like they're the same race, right? If a Hutu or Tutsi or Rwandan were both to migrate to the US, we would consider them both Black. So that would erase all these really important distinctions as well. And people are finding ways to maintain those differences among themselves, even when it's illegal to talk about it openly. So resistance can be not just physical, but also symbolic and cultural in really powerful ways. that leads into my question, picking up on Richard's, which is that we're all talking about global historical race and racism, but obviously in the places we study, race is practiced differently. So I would love to hear from the different panelists, when you started writing your paper, what idea of race were you working with, and how did that influence your approach to your research?
Can I jump in just my prerogative as, I don't know, timekeeper or something, which I just realized we have 9 minutes left. This conversation has been great, but I want to allow Rose and Gary to pose their questions, and then the panelists can sort of take their, I wish you could answer all of this, but we don't have enough time. So maybe Rose, if you could ask your question, and then Gary, and then the panelists can respond as they please.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina. Thank you to all of the panelists. I'll try and keep my question as concise as an academic is able to. So my question is about not being a historical scholar, what you all think that, or what you all wish that sociologists that are not directly studying the history of race and racism would take away from these conversations in this scholarship and bring into their work. So like medical sociologists who are studying racial disparities in mortality outcomes, or urban sociologists who are studying the concentration of violence and poverty in segregated Black and Latino neighborhoods, or education scholars who are studying how Black parents navigate different structures within school systems. What do you wish people would draw from these conversations about race into those sort of studies of like the effects of racism and how race is reproduced in smaller ongoing ways?
Yeah, I'm going to also try to keep my question short and as succinct as possible. My question has to do actually with Heidi's mention of the term, interest in the racialization of sovereignty. And I'm curious to kind of like hear more about the panelists' take on, what does it take to racialize sovereignty? What does it mean? And in turn, pushing going forward with that, whether to also perhaps think about whether thinking about racialized sovereignty also pushes us to rethink what sovereignty consists of and what we consider to be sovereign, for example. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I can go first just to touch on these two questions. So to start with Rose's question, I think, similar to Louisa's critiques of kind of dominant US-centric scholarship about race in sociology, there's this idea that most scholars are like, okay, we know that racialization comes out of these settler colonial projects in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, but then the settler colonial frame really drops from view, and that has been corrected, in recent years. But I think even in very like presentist work about race, and my project spans to 2018 and to the present in some ways, and it starts in the 1970s, so it's very contemporary history. But even in very presentist sociologies of race in education, in healthcare, policing, that it's still a settler colonial structure that is driving these processes. And somehow that is not always a part of the conversation. There's a really good study about gentrification where it is. And there's, it's coming in more and more, but that's, I think, my main kind of suggestion. And then racialized sovereignty. Yeah. So the idea with that concept is that both sovereignty in the sense of kind of what are the credible claims people make to rule over land, those myths share a lot with the myths that inform racialization. And so looking at those historically helps you understand what informs these kind of cultural modes of claims. And so they're really overlapping in these intricate ways. And I would say even they cannot be disentangled, right? That what creates race also creates all of these meta narratives that inform sovereignty.
Louisa, do you want to go, and then Mishal?
Yeah, so I'm gonna, there's a lot of questions. So I'm gonna answer part of Richard's question, and also, I guess, together with Elisa's. So I'm going to mix them up a little bit. I guess the point in that paper is that instead of defining race, I was interested in the categories and an idea about groupness. So I'm influenced by Mara Loveman and Brubaker, right? Although I use the idea of status group instead of closure. So there's a reconfiguration of status groups, right? Whereas, and also of, so this creation, so we shouldn't project our racial categories on historical events, right? And historical peoples, right? So, there was and so this way, we can understand how race becomes relevant, right? And so that's kind of the idea. So I'm interested in how this category, Black, White, Indigenous, become relevant for people's lives, right? And how it wasn't before, like it was, there were other, so that has to do with also the reason why you can't talk about, right? Enslavement was about going to war with other people, right? People in Angola, they would enslave people who are war convicts, which is actually in Europe was the same thing, right? Convicts and war captives, right? And so this is kind of how it starts, and don't enslave their own people, right? And so if you understand it that way, right, that there is your people and the other people, or people that you consider convict, which actually nowadays we imprison them, right? So we also take out their freedom, right? So this is different from what becomes later, right? Kind of a commodification of enslaved people, right? So it kind of starts through the system, but then it becomes a business, right? And people get just kind of bought and sold, like if you're from Africa, they get bought and sold, right, or something. And the social distinctions as this old system of classification and distinction breaks down, right, and you create the colonial and racial one. So that's what I'm using, but I'm not using this, what is race? Like, it's more like what categories become relevant for distinction. That's what the question I'm asking in this paper, right? But other papers could ask other questions about race.
Okay, I'll try and just say a few things to wrap this up. I think just quickly in response to Rose's question, probably not in response to all of it, but one takeaway I think, which is really important for all the contexts that we all study, no matter what it is, as you mentioned, medical sociology, urban history, urban sociology, is to really think about the good guys, think about the people who are trying to think about the discourses that are mobilized in quote unquote good faith and with good intentions, and the sort of repercussions that they might have in the future. So I think one of the powers, one of the most powerful thing about historical research is that we have a capsule into time. It's a time capsule. We can sort of see where we are today and think about how it is that liberal ideologies, how it is that humanitarian ideologies, human rights ideologies at different moments in time reverberate out. So I think it's as important as I said, it's as important to pay attention to these legacies as it is to violence and, these more sort of pernicious processes that we're used to studying. So that's one thing. And then, just to respond to Eliza's question very quickly. And, this is just to sort of admit that I'm a product of my context, which is when I first came to this question, I was asking, are Indians racist? And how do I understand this? Well, let's look at the history of Blackness in India. And of course, the project has been to unpack that at every single turn, because of course, that's the wrong question. And that should never be the question. So, anytime you get into a sort of everyday conversation with someone, this comes up. I think we've probably all gotten into those conversations. So I think that's a really useful question to ask, because it really makes us reflect on how, what the work is that we're doing here and what the repercussions are for the public conversation and a better understanding of how these things actually function in the world. To be very honest about where we come from in these debates. So yeah, I'll end with that. Thank you for the great questions, and hopefully we can continue the conversation.
So thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. And Tad, I saw your final question, and I guess taking hopefully less than 30 seconds so we can all get on with our Friday. I think that what really connects these papers is to say that we have really rich scholarship, especially in US sociology, on histories and sociology of racism in the United States. But we can't necessarily use those purely as abstractions to apply to much of the rest of the world. At the same time, we need to recognize the historical legacies and travel of racial ideas. It's not a coincidence that Hitler justified his movements and colonialism of Ukraine upon US westward expansion and the settler colonial exploitation, violence, and genocide of indigenous Americans. It's also simultaneously not a coincidence that much of Japanese imperialism was also predicated similarly on ideas and ideologies of anti-Black racism in Korea and parts of the Japanese islands. So we need to think really closely about the ways in which racial ideas travel, how racism, beyond just attempting to define it, how it operates, permeates, and exists and structures not only the modern world, but throughout history, the way we live our lives. So thank you so much, everyone, for this wonderful conversation. And please feel free to email if you have any more questions or have access issues for the volume. Thank you so much, and take care.
Yes, and thank you, Sasha, and thanks to all of the other contributors. Let me just remind you that if you're interested, you can keep up with what CHAT, the Comparative Historical Analysis and Theory Network, is up to by signing up for our email updates at comparativehistorical.org. We are also a member-driven volunteer organization, so if you want to become involved, please let us know that as well. Thank you very much, and thanks once again to the contributors. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.